Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katherine Osterhaus. I am the IT Audit Manager at the Kansas Legislative Division of Post-Audit, and I'll be moderating this webinar today. I'd like to thank the National Conference of State Legislatures for funding, coordinating, and producing this webinar. Also, I want to thank the National Legislative Program Evaluation Society, one of the staff groups of NCSL, for co-sponsoring this event. We are glad to have you here today to hear about some unique data techniques featured in a recent report which won the 2015 NLPES Excellence in Research Methods Award. Our intent in this webinar is to demonstrate the challenges that the team faced in empirically measuring real-world outcomes of groups participating in a program to non-participants. More importantly, the presenter will demonstrate how the staff dealt with these challenges using a matched pair design and survival analysis. So if you find yourself in a similarly challenging situation, this presentation will show you how to approach it with an analysis that can be performed in many commonly used statistical software packages. The PowerPoint slides can be downloaded at any time during the presentation. Simply click on the Media Library icon, which is located in the upper right-hand corner. It looks like a yellow piece of paper with a blue bar graph in front of it. We have set aside a few minutes for our speaker to answer any questions you have after he is done presenting. You can ask a question at any time by entering it into the chat box located in the lower left-hand side of the screen. We will answer as many questions as time allows during this roughly 45-minute webinar. One more housekeeping thing before I introduce the speaker. Please mute your phone lines to prevent feedback. Okay, Mark West will be our presenter today. Mark is the Staff Director of the Methodology and Quality Assurance at the Florida Legislature's Office of Program Policy Analysis and Government Accountability, or OPPAGA, as you probably know it. Mark has served at OPPAGA for 11 years and has worked on a variety of criminal justice, education, health and human services, and general government projects. His research design and implementation work helped OPPAGA win 2 NLPES Excellence in Research Method Awards. Prior to coming to OPPAGA, Mark managed the operations of U.S. Government Environmental Program, the U.S.-Asia Environmental Partnership. Mark received his graduate training in social science statistics at UCLA and attended the University of California in Santa Barbara for his political science undergraduate degree. Fun fact, he holds a certificate in intermediate aerobics from Middlebury. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mark, and thank you, Mark, for joining us today.
Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon. As introduced, my name is Mark West, and I work for the Florida Legislature's Policy Evaluation Office, OPPAGA. Thank you all so much for making time to join us today. My talk today focuses on some of the methodological techniques used in OPPAGA's evaluation of expansion drug courts report number 1402. A copy of that report should be available for download in the library in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Before I go too far into this discussion, I do want to acknowledge the team that worked on this project. While I'm speaking today about some of the quantitative methodological analyses we performed in our evaluation of expansion drug courts, the lion's share of the project design and work was done by the team that was supervised by our Criminal Justice Staff Director, Claire Mazur, and the team also included our experienced Criminal Justice Chief, Byron Brown, our Office Criminologist, Dr. Jim Clark, and our now retired but never forgotten colleague, Lucy Ann Walker-Frazier. Just to give you all an overview for today's discussion, I'm going to first touch on the purpose and what I hope you all take away from this presentation. I'm then going to provide some background on expansion drug courts so you know what they are and what they're designed to do. This will include our scope, which leads to our quantitative research goals. When I discuss our quantitative research goals and strategy, I'm going to spend a few minutes explaining why we use a matched pair design and survival analysis to evaluate recidivism. Then I will get into how we implemented the research. And finally, I'll discuss the findings and conclusions from our quantitative research. The purpose of today's discussion is to show some of the data problems encountered and solutions implemented when our office used multi-agency data to evaluate a program, in this case, expansion drug courts. This presentation was designed with 2 audiences in mind. For practitioners of quantitative policy analysis, my hope is that this presentation will provide you with information about additional analytical tools that you can apply to your own projects if you are not already. Specifically, I hope you come away with the concept of using a matched pairs design as a possible solution to the age-old apples-to-apples problem. And I hope you see Cox regression survival analysis as a solution to the problem of varying lengths of risk exposure when you're comparing outcomes between groups. For everyone watching, I hope this presentation provides you with some concrete examples of the types of hurdles encountered and level of effort required to undertake quantitative analysis with multi-agency data. More to the point, the agencies whose programs we evaluate increasingly collect and maintain large and varied data sets, and analyzing their data helps our offices form insights about the policies and programs we all evaluate. But doing this type of analysis brings additional hurdles. First, we have to identify and understand what data is available from agency data sources and other sources, and we have to understand the limits of that data. After identifying the data that we can use, obtaining the data can often be a long process. There's getting formal approval, there's making sure that the data that you receive is the actual data that you requested, and when you have multiple agencies involved, this process can become more drawn out. Even once you've obtained data, there can be substantial time spent on validating, merging, and cleaning the data before it can be used to perform analysis. And finally, identifying an appropriate method for analyzing data is not always straightforward. Now I would like to provide you all with a little bit of background about Florida's expansion drug courts. The 2009 legislature expanded drug courts using federal funds. And from January 2009 through June of 2013, the program expended almost $18 million. The 2013 legislature appropriated an additional $5.8 million in state funds to operate these courts in fiscal year 2013-14. The new drug courts created by the 2009 legislature expanded Florida's drug court system by adding new post-adjudicatory or post-conviction courts to Florida's drug court system, which already included pretrial diversion drug courts. The purpose of the new expansion drug courts was to generate cost savings by diverting nonviolent felons with a history of drug problems away from prison. By 2010, 8 Florida counties operated expansion drug courts. The Office of State Courts Administrator helped select the counties that would operate expansion drug courts, and one of the factors used in selecting these counties was their high rate of prison entrances among prison-eligible offenders. In drug courts, judges, state attorneys, public defenders, treatment providers, case managers, and probation officers work together as a team to review participants' progress and compliance with program requirements. Participants are required to submit to random drug testing and required to participate in treatment sessions. Participants are also required to appear before drug court judges on a regular basis with decreasing frequency as they successfully progress through the program. Participants do have access to a continuum of treatment services, and participants are provided services such as job training. Next, I just want to give you all a little bit of background about drug court participants. Starting at demographics, the median age of participants was 31, 71% were male, and 60% were white. People who enter the program are screened to determine if they have a drug addiction. Only nonviolent persons with a history of drug addiction are admitted. Almost 60% of the people sentenced had a current drug offense. Others had offenses like third-degree burglary that supported a drug habit. The typical successful completer was in the program for 15 months. The Florida legislature directed our office to assess drug courts looking at program completion, costs, and participant recidivism. In the rest of today's discussion, I'm going to provide some detail about how we conducted the recidivism analysis. And I will also discuss how we used some of the data we collected to provide the legislature with information about costs. We needed to determine if expansion drug court participants had different recidivism rates than similar people who were convicted of similar crimes who were sentenced to prison. To accomplish this, we wanted to build a data set of drug court participants and similar people who were convicted of similar crimes. The problem we faced was that each person had a unique amount of time in which recidivism could occur. Because we were looking at people who exited prison or drug court between 2010 and 2013, we had people with as little as 4 months in which recidivism could have occurred and others with more than 3 years in which recidivism could have occurred. So we needed an analytical approach that accounted for the fact that individuals in our analysis had different lengths of time in which recidivism could occur. We used a matched pair design to deal with the need for comparing drug court participants to a group of similar people convicted of similar crimes. What a matched pairs is it's an approach for removing bias when comparing groups. A matched pair design can be used when there are two treatment conditions. In our case, we had people who went to prison and people who went to drug court. Here's an example of what the matched pair approach accomplished. Initially, in the data we collected, 35% of drug court participants and 57% of the potential comparison group had previously been incarcerated. You can see that difference on your slide. After the matching routine, 35% of drug court participants still had previously been incarcerated, but among the comparison group, there were also 35% of the cases that had been previously incarcerated. This occurred because we matched each drug court participant with a subject from the comparison group who had similar characteristics. To address the problem of differences in exposure time, we used Cox regression survival analysis. This approach is appropriate when among the subjects in your study there are different amounts of times in which the event you are measuring could occur. In our case, we had some people in our study who only had 4 months in which recidivism could occur, and there were others who had 38 months in which recidivism could occur, and the rest were somewhere in between. We used survival analysis because we needed to account for the fact that we did not have complete information for all these cases. Survival analysis is an approach that statistically deals with censored or truncated data, that is, data where the final outcome is only partially known, incomplete, or cut off. Survival analysis correctly incorporates information from both complete and incomplete observations to estimate most parameters. For those who want to see a how-to for programming survival analysis, I included some links that you can download, which are in the media library at the upper right corner of your screen. These provide examples of how to code survival analysis in FAST, SPSS, and Stata. And there are also some articles about when survival analysis is appropriate. The SAGE paper that is listed provides a good primer on survival analysis. Now I would like to discuss how we implemented this study. We collected data from 3 state offices. The Office of State Courts Administrator provided us data on who participated in drug courts and some of their characteristics. The Florida Department of Corrections provided us with a pool to use for creating our comparison group and prison and probation data for both groups. And the Florida Department of Law Enforcement provided us with arrest and conviction data. We used the data from these offices to create a pool of drug court participants and a pool of potential comparison group members. The data included people who exited prison or drug court between 2010 and 2013. We limited our analysis to people who exited by June 30th of 2013, and we had conviction data going out to October, the end of October of 2013. So for everyone in the study, we had a minimum of at least 4 months of exposure time. This next slide provides some detail about the matched pair procedure, but I do want to note that just getting to this point where we had requested, obtained, cleaned, validated, and organized the data in order to do the matched pair procedure did take several months. Now, some of that time was going back and forth with the agencies to get the request right, but prepping these files was a fairly large lift in terms of data management on our side. After cleaning, looking at dates, and validating, we had 1,164 drug court cases that could be matched against a comparison group pool of 19,532. We matched each drug court participant with a prison exeter who shared these 7 characteristics, and that list should include all 7 of the characteristics that we were matching on. We did 2 rounds of matching. We did 1 round and got a 90% match, and we did a second round and also got a 90% match. So overall, this yielded a file of just over 3,000 cases that we could use for analysis. We performed Cox regression survival analysis, which accounts for exposure time and other individual traits of subjects in both groups to provide a statistical estimate of the likelihood that subjects in both groups would recidivate as a function of the number of days in which they could have recidivated. In the report, we share the results of 3 models. First is the core model estimating where a drug court participant First is the core model estimating whether a drug court participant is more or less likely to be convicted of a felony than a member of the comparison group. Second, based on the felony conviction model, the second model measures whether the county of drug court that a person attends affects their likelihood of recidivism. And finally, the third model looks at whether drug court participants are less likely than a comparison group to be convicted of any crime. So that includes felonies and misdemeanors. The findings from our core model support our conclusion that expansion drug court participants are less likely to recidivate than similar people who committed similar crimes and were sentenced to prison. Just to help orient you all with this chart, lower means better. As you can see, as we follow the drug court exiters over time, that's the green line, they have a lower risk of being convicted of a felony than people in the comparison group, the red line. Our second model tested whether drug court participants from some counties were less likely to recidivate than others, and we found that the 3 counties plotted here drove the lower drug court recidivism finding. Now, looking a little bit closer at these counties, the first thing I want to note is that participants from these counties, they made up well over 50% of the cases in our analysis. So naturally, how those counties performed was going to influence our outcome. But 2 other things I wanted to note is, first, in 2 of the counties, Hillsborough and Broward, had some of the most extensive treatment options. If people weren't working out in one treatment setting, a judge had many options in where to move that person. Also, these 2 counties required more regular appearances before judge during a person's drug court participation. And this may have had a positive effect on outcomes, as 88% of drug court participants we surveyed believed that the judges played a constructive role in helping them avoid relapse. The third model, again, moves away from looking at just felony convictions and looks at all convictions, felonies and misdemeanors, but finds a similar outcome. As we found in the felony conviction model, it shows that drug court participants, again in green, were less likely to recidivate. If you're wondering about the steeper curve in this model compared to the other ones, it's because there's more crimes in which people are getting convicted of because we're including those misdemeanors. We use the data we collected to estimate an average cost of successful drug court completers, which was just under $17,000. And this can be compared to over $26,000 in prison costs for people in the comparison group. In our cost discussion, we noted that in order for drug courts to save the state money on prison confinement, it is important that they serve people who would otherwise have gone to prison. If drug courts are used to serve persons who would otherwise have been in some other setting like community supervision, which has a lower annual cost, or lower than $8,000 on average, then the program will not be as effective at reducing costs. And we provided this table to the legislature showing that in order for the program to have a positive effect on costs, most participants need to have been prison-bound. And the savings increase as the rate of prison-bound participants increases. And that concludes my prepared remarks. Thank you all, and I think we do have some time for questions.
Wow, that was definitely fascinating and very, very technical. So very much appreciated your presentation today. We are ready for our question and answer segment now. I do see a few questions, and if others are on the line still and have additional questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat box, and I will pick them up and pull them back to Mark. The first question we have is from Justin, and he wants to know if you could explain further why you used matched pair rather than any other approaches to control for differences in groups. Maybe go a little bit more into that.
Happy to. Well, first off, whether we're doing quantitative or qualitative analysis, if you can do triangulation, that is, use multiple approaches to test your conclusions. You try one approach, you get a conclusion. If you use a different approach, you get a different, or you can confirm or get a different conclusion. That lets you know how strong your findings are. So when we're talking about quantitative analysis where we want to control for differences between groups, there's approaches like matched pairs, there's traditional regression, and there's propensity scoring. So there's different approaches you can use. If you have the resources and time to try different ones to confirm each other to make sure that you really got a solid finding, that's ideal. If you have to pick one, there's different things you can consider. We were looking to be able to to analyze most of the people that we had from who had completed drug court. So we wanted to have a really high match rate. So we were happy to be in the 90% range of our match rate. If you had lower match rates, you might not want to use that approach. There's a pretty rich literature on this, so I don't want to get into all the ins and outs, and I'm sure I wouldn't cover them all. One thing I will say about matched pair approaches as opposed to some others is that when you go and talk to people who aren't necessarily really familiar with what regression techniques accomplish, telling them that you've accounted for differences with regression. I'm not always sure if how convincing that is to them or how well people understand that. With matched pair, you can really show, hey, if you're concerned about this group having too many of whatever characteristics, when we designed our study, we made sure that the groups had similar amounts of those characteristics. So I think that is one reason to use it.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. Another question came in from Brad. He wants to know, did you receive any criticisms on your methodology, and if so, what types of criticisms were they, and what did you do to address those?
We didn't receive any criticisms that specific to our methodology that I can think of. Internally we had a lot of discussions about them, and we were pretty confident. What we've presented here were our final results, but we looked at a lot of dimensions of how to tackle this problem. So there wasn't anything specific that really sticks out. I think we felt like we had our bases pretty well covered. Again, internally there were a lot of discussions, and we looked at a lot of different approaches. And again, the one thing that was motivating us was, and this is any quantitative or qualitative analysis, are the choices you're making causing you to find certain things that you otherwise wouldn't find? So we did a lot of sort of cross-checking to make sure that we weren't excluding certain cases that were going to change the end result.
Great. And then actually there's a kind of a follow-up from Kyle about going back to the matched pair question. He wants to know, how did you know that there were not any unmeasured differences between those matched groups? So I know on the slide you had the 7 differences in characteristics, gender, age, and those things, but how did you know that you accounted for the big ones?
Okay, well, first of all, you're never going to be 100% positive that there's not some unaccounted for variable. But of course, what we did was we went and looked at the literature to see what sort of things do affect recidivism, and then we looked to see what data was out there where we could operationalize those things. So we felt like we covered a lot of what we needed to cover through the matched pair, and then also in the regression model that we built. But he's absolutely right. It's one of the things in quantitative research, that especially when people are doing modeling, that there can always be a lurking variable. And the best way to deal with that is to try to stay as on top of the literature. Read everything, see what sorts of things other people are finding, to make sure that you've accounted for everything that can be accounted for. And if there's something, of course, that can affect your results that you can't account for, it's good to try to be open and clear. Hey, we found this, but we weren't able to cover the specific things which other people think might matter.
Sorry, I had my mute button on. So follow up on this one. On the 7, again, the 7 characteristics, were they pretty much clear from the start because of the literature searching, or did you have to kind of take another run at it by finding yet another core characteristic and had to add those in and rerun certain things, or were they pretty clear from the beginning?
So they were pretty clear from the beginning. We did have a pretty knowledgeable and experienced criminologist on this study who was familiar with the literature, and his view that these were things that were pretty straightforward, although you do go and confirm and make sure that there aren't other things that you're missing. The trickier part and the more time-consuming part, at least in this study, was going out to the agencies and figuring out what they had and how good what they had in terms of data would be at helping you cover what you wanted to try to cover.
Makes sense. I had another question from Justin. Please explain more about how you selected drug court cases you did analyze. Who was not included in the analysis? Okay,
so some of the specific numbers on that are listed in the appendix. We go through in some detail. But just 2 of the main reasons why data that we received on drug court participants didn't make it into the final model that come to mind. First is if there were people who were still participating in the program, then they weren't included. And also, there were cases where you saw things like people were sentenced to drug court, but if they had charges pending or something else happened in another county, but they ended up not entering drug court, then those would be cases that we wouldn't use. And again, in the appendix, we go into some accounting of, we dropped this many people for this reason, this many people for that reason.
Thank you. Marina wants to know, you talked about how sentencing someone to drug court is cheaper than sending them to prison, but are there also savings because of the lower recidivism rate? Can you speak to that?
Yes, our report does get to that. On page 13, I think, it's towards the end, we show an estimate for avoided costs due to the lower recidivism rate of drug court participants, where we're actually looking, hey, you're avoiding these prison costs. I think the estimate there, and everything that we factored into that estimate is explained there. I think it was around $500,000 a year in avoided prison costs, but I checked the report to make sure of that exact number, but that's the number that sticks out.
Okay. I think I can answer the question from Amber. She was wanting to know if this was a statewide analysis, but I think you mentioned somewhere about the 8 or so. Maybe pick that up and explain the areas that actually covered this study.
So in the year that we were asked to do this study, the state started funding counties, these post-conviction drug courts in counties. So there was state funding going to these courts in counties. They weren't in all counties. They were in the 8 counties that we listed in the background slides.
Perfect. And then I do have a couple questions on my own. You mentioned the length of time it takes you to clean the data and get it all ready, and that in and of itself was about 3 months. Can you kind of give us a timeline for the entire audit, how long it took overall, and how much of that was spent on kind of the cleaning, prepping, not so much fun stuff until you actually got to the real analysis part of it?
Not including all the time we spent on the write-up, but probably 6 months from when we were officially directed to do it to when we had everything completed. That I know that time may sound long, and certainly when you're in the middle of it, it's long. But we did have the advantage that several people on this project were really familiar with recidivism and really familiar with some of the data in these different agencies, and more importantly, knew some of the data people in these agencies. So we were able to figure this out. And I'm pointing this out because, well, 6 months may seem like a long time. I think something that's involved, it didn't seem to me like a ridiculous amount of time to get this much work done.
I agree. That time always goes faster than you want it to. Yeah. I don't see any more questions from the audience, so if the audience still has additional questions, we still have some time to cover more questions. So please add that in the chat box. I do want to know if the results of this caused any changes with the legislature. Are they providing additional funding or continued funding, or where's this program now?
Yes, the legislature continued to fund it, and they also strengthened the requirements to make sure that the participants were prison bound, because I made that point that if these post-conviction courts aren't serving the prison bound, then there is a problem with cost savings.
Were there any other great changes that came out of the audit or recommendations that got picked up either by the legislature or by the agencies themselves?
Increased inpatient treatment is one thing that comes to our mind. So when you're able to, that does cost a little more, but when you're seeing good results for people who are getting that, then that is something that did increase, and it's something that we noted in the study.
Yeah, I think somewhere in the report it pointed out there were some differences between counties. Some of them had better or more varieties of treatment. So what you're saying is that was kind of a benefit to say, hey, the more variety and the more treatment options you have, the better the results could be?
Yes, and when we were looking at it, it was interesting to see the counties that were doing well, because they weren't necessarily they weren't necessarily the counties that, if you were to look at things like sentencing scores, that you would necessarily think would do the best, but they had this large variety of services, and so that did seem like something that was driving those results.
Great, thank you. I do have a question from David. He wants to know, in the matched pair analysis, how good of a match was acceptable? Was there some sort of a line in the sand?
I don't. It really does depend on the study. It really does. I mean, there you can go and read. One of the things that's more important statistically is how representative your final group is. If your final group has a bunch of characteristics that everyone knows are important to whatever you're studying that aren't similar in their proportions to the overall population, then you've got a problem. There's also more, just going back to straight face tests, when you tell people that you've excluded, some huge percentage, then even people who aren't that statistically inclined will sometimes, raise questions or have concerns. So we certainly were comfortable with our 90%, but we weren't just comfortable because it was 90%. We were also comfortable when we looked at, after doing the match and who we couldn't match, how severe were the rates in the population that were changing, and they weren't severe. I mean, remember, when you're matching on 7 different things, that's a lot of specific things that all have to line up in order to get a match. There are people who would there's different approaches to doing it too, where you could have less restrictive matches and try to account for more things in your regression model.
Great. I see another question coming in from Kathy. She wants to know whether you would recommend this approach when there are a larger number of participants to match.
When there's a larger number of participants to match?
Yeah.
Again, I think that one of the key things is going to be if you can maintain how representative of the population that your final group is, then you're going to be okay. So size won't be such a big factor. However, if that larger group means that you're getting a lower match rate and you're ending up with a less representative sample, then you certainly, with a less representative sample, it's harder to generalize and say, hey, for these people we found this, and we generalize to say that this program's successful, because then you're starting to think, well, maybe it's the characteristics of the group that you select. I mean, that's one of the core principles that you're trying to guard against when you specify any type of model or use any of these approaches.
So if the group gets too big, maybe think about subgroups.
That's one. Yeah, that is one possible approach as well. And it depends on how big a group you have to match it against too.
True.
I mean, that's going to be and what their variation looks like. If you can find matches is basically what I'm saying.
I see a question from Eric. I'm not quite sure I'm going to understand that, so I'm going to read it and see if you can help him out on this one. He wants to know, can you match with replacement if the potential comparison group is smaller than the treatment group?
I don't, I'm not certain off the top of my head on that one. That's a really good question. I'd want to think about that one a little bit. That sounds possible, but I kind of want to think about the ins and outs before I said something definitive on that. So it's a really good question.
Great. And audience, you all participating lively in all these wonderful questions. So we do have a few more minutes before we close. Are there any other questions that anybody would like to ask Mark? I don't see any other questions coming in. So I'm going to just kind of give it a couple more seconds here. But if nobody else has any questions, I think we are coming towards the end of our webinar. Again, thank you so much, Mark, for this presentation, and to NCSL and to NLPES for sponsoring and co-sponsoring this event. And thank you all for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on the NCSL website in about a week. And please do go to www.ncsl.org/webinars to access our archive. And that does conclude our webinar. And again, thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today.
And I'd like to thank everyone, and you particularly, Katrin, for doing a great job moderating. Thank you.
Thank you.